Hello and welcome to this short revision guide for the Liberal government reforms, the social reforms of 1906 to 1914. Now you can watch this video embedded on YouTube or you can see it on historyhelper.co.uk. I would advise that you go onto full screen so that you can see all of the words nice and clearly. So let's start. Now the first thing to remember is that the Liberal government was elected with a huge majority in 1906. They promised wholesale social and political reform. Now in this we're going to deal with the social reform. Their first Prime Minister from 1906 to 1908 was Henry Campbell Bannerman, and then after 1908 they were led by the New Liberals. Herbert Asquith became Prime Minister, David Lloyd George was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Winston Churchill was the President of the Board of Trade. Okay, so let's have a look at the reforms then. Now, they were designed to help various groups of people in society. So we have children, the elderly, the sick, and the unemployed. Now what the Liberal government tried to do is they created various Acts of Parliament during these next few years which helped these areas of society in very specific ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each area now and go through some of the acts, not all of them, just a few, and some of the important facts that you need to know about them. So let's start with children. Now there was the School Meals Act of 1906. Now this gave funding to local educational authorities for children to receive a hot meal at school, and the results of this were that children began to put on weight and became healthier. Don't forget that at home many families were extremely poor and couldn't actually afford to feed their children properly, so it helped battle against malnutrition. Now we also had the School Medical Inspections Act of 1907. Now this was pretty good because it meant that every child was checked by a doctor once a year. But the problem is, if something was found to be wrong, you still had to pay then for the child to be treated. Now that didn't change until 1913. You've also got the Children's Act of 1908, and this helped children become protected citizens. For instance, they couldn't buy tobacco or they couldn't buy alcohol, etc. So look at your revision books because there's quite a lot of detail about that which you need to revise. Okay, so we've done the children. Now let's move on to the elderly. Now, the Old Age Pension Act of 1908 was extremely important. It took away the threat of the workhouse and reliance on the family. Many people who reached old age simply had no income, and it meant that they would have to go to a workhouse and spend the rest of their days doing useless jobs which would result in them essentially earning nothing. So the new scheme meant that people aged over 70, single people, would receive 5 shillings per week, and married people would receive 7 shillings 6 pence per week, 6d per week, and that married number later changed to 10 shillings, so it essentially became 5 shillings per week per person. Now once again, look in your revision booklets about the Old Age Pension Act. There's a few more little details there that you need to know, but this presentation gives you the basic ideas. Okay, so we've done the elderly. Let's now move on to the unemployed. Now there were two things that the Liberal government did for the unemployed. Firstly, the Labour Exchanges Act of 1909. Now this is where employers could advertise local jobs, and during 1910 83 exchanges were set up. Basically, if you were somebody out of work and you were looking for work in your local area, before the labour exchanges you'd have to traipse around the area looking in individual steel works or coal mines or factories or wherever you wanted to go, and it could take you a whole day to go around 4 or 5 different places in your local area. With the labour exchange it meant that you could advertise centrally. It's rather like a modern day job centre. Now the next thing was the National Insurance Act, Part 2 of 1912. Now this was aimed at helping seasonal workers like shipbuilders, people in the building trade, where you'd have a project for 9 months of the year, but then for 3 months, once your ship was built or your building was built, you'd be out of work again, so you'd be stuck with no income. Essentially, you paid into an insurance scheme, and it meant that you could claim 7 shillings a week for up to 15 weeks of the year when you were unemployed. Okay, so let's move on now to the sick. Now, National Insurance Act Part 1 was extremely important because It gave workers an income should they become sick. In this day, the Edwardian era, there were many industrial accidents. There wasn't much in the way of good medical provision because there was no national health service in those days. So if you became sick, you pretty much had it, really, and your family could fall into poverty very, very quickly. Don't forget that most men were the breadwinners. They would earn the money, and they would be expected to support their wife and their family. If they became sick and couldn't work, they couldn't do it. So, under National Insurance Act Part 1, workers would pay into an insurance scheme. So a worker would pay 4D into the insurance scheme, and in return their employer would pay in 3D, and the government then an additional 2D. Now this meant, as Lloyd George described, that workers got 9 for 4, 9 for 4, because the workers only had to pay 4, and yet the government and the employer contributed a further 5, making 9D. Now, once you'd paid into this scheme, if you then fell ill, you were entitled to receive 10 shillings a week for up to 26 weeks. So that's half a year. After which, you'd be paid a 5 shillings disability pension per week. So essentially, if you weren't able to return to work after half a year, you wouldn't simply fall off the insurance ladder, as it were. You would still then be entitled to a disability pension, although it would be half as much. However, if you think about it, there was nothing before this scheme was brought in. So it's an extremely good step in the right direction, but it didn't solve everything. So that's it for this one. I hope those little guides have been useful. Of course, you can wind the movie back and move it forward and look at the bits you're not sure of. You can even try copying down some of the things as I talk about them. If you've got any more ideas for me, or you want to tell me whether this was useful, then you can email at admin@historyhelper.co.uk or go to the feedback on historyhelper.co.uk. I do appreciate hearing what you think of this presentation, because I can do many more of them if they're useful. Okay, any questions, get in touch, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.